Good morning and welcome. My name is Ian Martin, I'm Deakin's Vice-Chancellor, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 2020 Deakin University Brookes Oration. As we gather here this morning, physically dispersed and yet virtually connected, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we are located today. I join you today on the traditional land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, of all the lands on which we live and work, and recognise their continuing connections to land, water and community. I also pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present. Welcome to our 2020 Brookes Orator, Mr. John Denton, who I shall introduce in a moment. Deakin University staff, students, alumni, friends, colleagues, and in particular, I welcome members of the Brookes family and offer this morning my best wishes, but also condolences for the recent loss of Roger. Roger Brookes was a long-time friend and supporter of the university, the Australian education and arts sectors, and many vital community services. He was fully engaged in the community and was a champion of many, many causes out there. He placed a very high value on preserving and adding to Australia's rich cultural heritage and recognised that empathy and understanding are built on the sharing of stories and knowledge. Earlier this year, Roger established the Brookes Cultural Heritage Scholarship in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin to support research into cultural heritage and museum studies. Roger was a wonderful friend of Deakin. I greatly enjoyed my interactions with him. He also was very valued by so many other community organisations. And as a foundation part of the Brookes Oration, he will absolutely be missed. It's important that we continue the tradition of the Brookes Oration this year, even though we're not able to gather physically. It is great to be able to do this online. We've shown that over the last 4 or 5 months, we can be incredibly adaptable and actually are doing things that we want to keep into the future. Today's Brookes Oration is a continuation of a tradition that was started in 2006 by the Deakin Business School, supported by Roger, to encourage thoughtful debates on the contribution of corporate Australia in the global community. It's named in honour of the significant contribution of Sir Wilfred Brookes, grandson of Alfred Deakin, the second Prime Minister of Australia, after whom Deakin University is named. And the oration reflects Roger's passion for the ongoing betterment of society and its institutions. Sir Wilfred continued the family's association with the university as chairman of the Deakin University Foundation, and in 1981, Sir Wilfred honoured us by giving an address to the first MBA class. And each year since then, Deakin's top 2 MBA graduates are presented with the Brookes Medal. The Brookes Oration has been delivered by many, many distinguished Australians, and this year is no different. We're privileged to hear from John Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. Mr. Denton is a board member of the United Nations Global Compact and a founding member of Business 20, the Australia-China CEO Roundtable, and the UNHCR in Australia. He serves on the board of leading global infrastructure group IFM Investors and is co-chair of the Trade and Investment Working Group for the G20 Japan. He co-led the Australian government's 2012 white paper on Australia in the Asian century and previously chaired the APEC Finance and Economics Working Group. A former diplomat, Mr. Denton served for 2 decades as partner and chief executive officer of Cause Chambers Westgarth, Australia's leading independent law firm. In 2015, he was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia for his services to the business community, the arts, and the rights of refugees, including as a founder of Human Rights Watch Australia and Teach for Australia. Mr. Denton is an alumnus of the Harvard Business School and the University of Melbourne. His topic for the 2020 Brookes Oration could not be more pertinent and topical: the long-term impact of COVID-19 on international trade and its ramifications for Australia in a post-COVID global economy. This is a topic that is going to continue to be debated for some time, and I'm absolutely convinced the insights we gather from Mr. Denton this morning will really help that consideration. Thank you so much for agreeing to deliver the 2020 Brookes Oration, and welcome to all our colleagues.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Greetings. John Denton here. I am the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris. Under normal circumstances, I will be with you in person today. But as has become the new norm for so many of us, I am instead speaking to you from my office in the French capital. I have been invited to speak on the subject of COVID-19 and its implications for international trade and for Australia. But first, I want to expressly thank Deakin University, the Brookes family, and Vice-Chancellor Ian Martin for the generous opportunity to speak to you today. I would also like to add to the Vice-Chancellor's words on the recent passing of Roger Brookes. I did not have the pleasure of knowing Roger, but I know that his deep commitment to philanthropy and community engagement will live on through the contributions he and the Brookes family have made. And my condolences go to them for their loss. For the past 14 years, the Brookes Oration has focused attention on corporate Australia's role in global affairs, and I am honoured now to be part of what has become a tradition. I started my career in diplomacy, but have actually spent the majority of it in the private sector, first as a young lawyer and later a senior partner at the distinguished firm Cause Chambers Westgarth. I was actively engaged for many years in international matters, from the APEC Business Advisory Council to co-founding the Australia-China CEO Roundtable and to co-founding the B20. In addition to now leading ICC, I also serve on the board of IFM Global Investors, one of the world's leading infrastructure investment firms based in Melbourne, and I remain very much connected to the Australian business community. In the Vice-Chancellor's initial letter to me, he noted an interesting connection between ICC and the Brookes family. Roger's father, Sir Wilfred Brookes, served as president of the Victorian Chamber of Manufacturers from 1913 to 1917, and later joined the Bureau of Commerce and Industry as World War I drew to an end. The Bureau, as we now know it, is part of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, better known as ACCI, and is remarkably also nearing its 170th anniversary. ACCI, in turn, is a member of ICC and has been a part of our family for more than 70 years, so the link is truly well established. But if I could, the period during which Sir Wilfred joined the Bureau of Commerce was a devastating one that altered the course for many nations, many communities and many families. For students of history, you will know that it was the conflict in which Australia made its greatest sacrifices in terms of lives lost. Looking back, we see clearly how the human toll, coupled with the investment in wartime necessities, provoked tremendous changes at the economic and societal levels for Australia. And it was amid the ashes of this global struggle and the effort to recover from it that the ICC was founded. The vision set forth by our founders was both simple and bold: to promote peace and prosperity through international trade. The inspiration for this derived from the strong conviction of our founders that strong commercial relations between nations will help goods move and services move, and nowadays data flow across borders without the need for troops. Today, ICC is the institutional representative of more than 45 million businesses in more than 100 countries, and we are the only private sector organisation with a permanent seat at the United Nations. We are independent, we are not-for-profit, we are politically unaligned, and our mission is to make business work for everyone, every day, everywhere. How we do that, in line with our founding vision, has taken many forms, from creating Incoterms as the world's essential terms of trade, to drafting the New York Convention that gave rise to international arbitration and our world-leading arbitral court. In fields such as commercial law and in trade finance, we set globally accepted standards, and we increasingly focus on providing solutions to our global network. Working in partnership with leading companies and organisations who want, as we do, to tackle action at scale, to tackle some of the most pressing challenges we collectively face. We create policies, we set standards, we govern those standards through our courts, and we scale globally. We can act and lead in sectors of the economy where governments are enabled. Since March, this has included COVID-19 and our response. This gave rise to a unique and difficult set of challenges that have required yet another shift in our commitment to enable us to meet the ambition of our global business community. Over these past few months, we have faced a battle of a very different kind from that waged over 100 years ago. Our common foe in this fight does not wear a uniform or respect any rules of engagement. The coronavirus at the source of this pandemic does not recognise borders and will not negotiate its surrender, though we would certainly welcome that. It is instead silent, it is invisible, and it can be lethal. It has rendered our global connectivity a weakness as it spreads, affecting virtually every country on Earth. In France, where I live, this country of 66 million people is now in full recession, and GDP is expected to fall by more than 11% this year alone, even as the government has injected billions into propping up businesses and seeking to preserve jobs. In the United States, more people applied for unemployment in 1 week in July than in any similar period during the 2008 global financial crisis. Even in Australia, where the number of infections and fatalities remain much lower than other parts of the world, the country has to date lost nearly 7% of payroll jobs and arguably more in the informal economy. And we note with concern the recent state of emergency declared in Victoria. The pandemic has disproportionately affected certain groups of people, including the poorest and most vulnerable amongst us. In the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer, 2/3 of respondents affirmed the view that those with less education, less money and fewer resources are being hit the hardest. Nearly the same number said the crisis has revealed for them the great gap between the rich and the working class and convinced them that something must be done to achieve a fairer distribution of wealth and prosperity. We have real challenges, my friends. For ICC, responding urgently to preserve livelihoods as we endeavour to help save lives is our top priority. And like many organisations, we have completely adapted what we do to meet the demands of this critical moment. In March, we began our first ever collaboration with the World Health Organization to inform and guide businesses through this crisis. And we co-launched our first ever call for international debt relief in April, with the international trade union movement and with civil society to aid least developed countries and middle-income economies struggling to service repayments as they try to provide health services to their people and support their real economies. Together with the World Trade Organization and World Customs Organization, ICC has pushed strongly for maintaining the flow of agricultural products and services and other essential goods and services across borders. We also launched an SOS campaign to save our SMEs, which have a critical need for emergency financing to remain afloat and to keep employing people. Looking inwards, we have adapted how we work at ICC as we've taken our global operations completely digital, and we are now discussing what form our future collaboration as colleagues will take as a completely digital organisation. Through all of this, one of the clearest and most universal challenges put to the world by COVID-19 is adapting to uncertainty. From early questions on how the virus propagated to current questions on the alphabet soup of economic recoveries in countries emerging from the state of lockdown. The cruelty of COVID-19 is its asynchronous nature. As one part of the world tries to reboot, another goes into lockdown, and then we turn around again. More than any event in the past 75 years, COVID-19 has shaken the foundations on which we have constructed the global economy, our policy priorities, and our assumptions about the future. One of the areas most disrupted is global trade. Friends, in 2018, total trade in goods alone amounted to $19.5 trillion, nearly 15% of global GDP, driving growth. In 2019, with tensions flaring between the US and China, this dashed hopes for higher global growth. Yet the reports on trade flows continued to trend positive. Then in late December of 2019, when COVID-19 began its spread, hopes that it would be no worse than the SARS virus of 2003 quickly faded. And in April this year, the WTO issued predictions that world trade would plummet by up to 1/3 as consumers remained confined to their homes and most transport and travel was curtailed under emergency measures to contain COVID-19 spread within communities and across borders. We experienced and continue to experience a simultaneous demand and supply shock to the real economy. Now companies of all sizes and in almost every industry and sector have felt the effects of this pandemic, even as some parts of the world are yet to overcome peak COVID. There have been landmark bankruptcies of companies that were once household names. Businesses operating internationally with complex global value chains found their suppliers shutting down or unable to deliver. With movement restricted, migrant farmers are blocked from tending to withering crops, affecting the price and supply of many foods. Small businesses, which make up the lion's share of most economies, are decimated by strings of closures, and employers everywhere struggle to reduce costs and maintain their workforces. But sadly, millions are now in unemployment. Regionally, North America and Europe may face the greatest declines in the medium term, but it's likely that it will be Africa and Latin America that will suffer the most enduring losses. And the longer the pandemic continues, the more difficult the recovery will be. In taking stock of all this, it goes without saying that these are bleak times for the global economy. But the story of the COVID crisis is still being written as I speak to you, and I am optimistic that we can write a more uplifting ending. But we must address the fundamental fragilities exposed by this crisis if we want a resilient global economy in the future. We must draw on the learnings of these past few months and work collaboratively to build a more resilient and sustainable global economy. One clear lesson of COVID's impact is the need to diversify many pre-COVID global trade flows. UN data depicts an incredible concentration of world trade between just 3 regions: North America, Europe, and East Asia. With China, the EU, and the US included, it will be no surprise to you that the balance reflects the weight of these leading economies. But when China moved to nationalise the production of N95 masks in April, that action instigated a cascade of cancelled orders that sent ripple effects globally. It also shone a light on the over-reliance on one economy for imports of personal protective equipment, PPE, and other goods. This resulted not only in a further complication to managing the public health crisis, but it also exposed a clear risk to businesses looking to secure the full length of their far-flung value chains. Adding to this, the World Bank research traced some 70% of total ventilator exports to just 7 countries, principally European. Just one of these countries introducing an export ban would raise prices by an estimated 10% globally. So if we follow the time-honoured advice of financial advisors, diversifying sourcing, as with assets, it is a prudent measure for both business and government to improve supply chain security within an open and global market. Diversifying sourcing is critical for our future. Which brings me to the second learning, that of unnecessary trade restrictions. In this era of feeble international cooperation, many political leaders question whether they can rely on trading partners to allow the necessary goods and services to flow in times of crisis. By late March, when the wave of lockdowns had reached Europe and the US, 60 countries, 60 and counting, had enacted export bans for medical supplies and PPE. Many governments found themselves without sufficient stockpiles of masks, gloves, goggles, face shields, and ventilators. Those without a domestic producer of this equipment became targets of what we now know as sicken-thy-neighbour trade restrictions that cut off access to life-saving technology. In much of the global south, few countries are exporters of equipment like ventilators, putting entire regions in precarious positions when the trade ceased to flow. And as we saw in the years just after the global financial crisis, targeted export restrictions caused food prices to rise by an average of 13% at a time when so many could have ill afford the additional cost to keep food on the table. Heaven knows what will happen when the vaccine is actually enabled. We need to ensure this does not repeat when the logistics challenge of actually supplying the vaccine or vaccines to more than 8 to 9 billion people is upon us. We cannot allow a maintenance of sicken thy neighbour restrictions. And while WTO rules allow for the temporary restriction of trade, doing so in the midst of a global crisis is very different from an isolated emergency. These restrictions are ultimately short-sighted and counterproductive. They form part of a protectionist shift to onshoring production lines that seeks, in misguided fashion, to reduce the risk of trade lapses by requiring production onshore. This policy distortion, coupled with a resurgent discussion on industrial self-reliance, will, if unchecked, dramatically alter the landscape of global trade for the worse. It will lead to overall higher prices, reduced production, and increased product scarcity. Taking these learnings into account, I believe we must begin the next chapter on COVID-19's impact on international trade by reasserting our fundamentals. We must recommit to a rules-based multilateral trading order that promotes freer, fairer, and more sustainable trade. We must reassert that our trading system should strive to eliminate barriers and distortions, not enable them, that businesses should not be discriminated against and playing fields should be levelled, that domestic regulation should be transparent to foreign businesses to enable fair competition, and most critically, that the trading system should be governed not by power politics, but by the rule of law. These are our fundamentals. And the WTO, as the key global trade policy-making body, arbiter of disputes, and guard against protectionism, is the critical institutions for these reforms. For too long, the Geneva-based institutions' trade rules have been allowed to rest on the laurels of their creation, falling increasingly out of step with the realities of today's economy and the needs of voters throughout the world. New rules must be written to cover those areas of the modern global economy, such as digital trade and trade in services, that are not neatly dealt with by the pre-internet rules in place today. With the election of a new WTO Director General drawing near, there is also a need for global leadership that provides a compelling, practical, and positive vision of the future. I say this because acknowledging failings is not an admission of failure. It is instead an urgent call for reform of a system that has succeeded, but imperfectly. Only the 164 countries comprising the WTO's membership can enshrine meaningful reform in the text of global trade rules. But leadership on the principles that should underpin the modernisation of trade is not a niche issue for Geneva insiders. Business can and must be a powerful voice on international trade. Faced with increasing unilateralism, rising tariffs, and a proliferation of trade barriers, business needs to speak up and speak out. We are the end users of the system. In this time of fractured international political leadership, it falls to business to champion the multilateral trading order that is paramount for building broad-based global growth and a resilient recovery. The spirit of international cooperation that emerged during the last global crisis has not resurfaced during the current one. In 2008, G20 leaders rightly recognised the imperative to cooperate to preserve trade and investment and avert further global economic carnage as the global financial crisis deepened. But that collective motivation among world leaders to work together to solve big problems has all but evaporated today, particularly with respect to trade. The past few years have in fact seen near record levels of trade restrictive measures as tensions between leading powers have played out tit for tat. Indeed, multilateralism seems increasingly at odds with the prevailing political forces. In this political leadership vacuum, middle powers such as Australia, France, and Japan, countries that support a strong multilateral order, must seize the mantle of leadership. With global US leadership absent, middle power diplomacy must aim to broker progress where it can be done, while keeping a clear view on the horizon of reform. In this respect, Australia has shown great leadership on trade matters, digital especially, starting at a global level, with enduring support for the creation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and continued and very vocal support for multilateralism. Further, and in particular, the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement is an excellent recent example of setting new global benchmarks for trade rules fit for this century. Australia has also adeptly chaired ongoing WTO negotiations on e-commerce, which, if successful, will create new rules affecting privacy, security, data flows, and trade facilitation. We are a voice for the future. But no one country can achieve the necessary reforms on its own, even if it seems that one country alone is all that it takes to block them. Friends, the narrative of this crisis includes many encouraging signs of solidarity. From philanthropic contributions to protecting the health of the vulnerable and less privileged, to businesses retooling demand for essential medical supplies the world over, creating their own health systems. These sparks of light in an otherwise dark period show us what is possible, but the challenges I have described surpass what we can achieve acting individually. We live in an era which promises more disruption, not less, more challenges, not fewer. And as I mentioned earlier, uncertainty will be the dominant challenge of the coming months and years. We will need to apply fresh thinking to be responsive and to adapt. When I assumed leadership of ICC just over 2 years ago, I determined that, like any organisation that wishes to endure, ICC must ensure that it evolves with the times, reinvigorating its purpose in line with contemporary and future needs, and allowing the spirit of modernity to flow through it. The same must hold true for the WTO and the institutions that comprise our global institutional architecture. They must modernise if we are to unlock the potential of a freer, fairer, and more sustainable global economy. Modernised rules and revitalised institutions will empower us to address more intractable problems and better resolve disputes and frictions when they arise. But we must not lose sight of the human dimension in abstract debates over policy. As the WHO Director General put it plainly, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of a simple truth. We are one humanity. We share the same planet. We share the same hopes and dreams. We share the same destiny. In these uncertain times, these words ring true. We may accept that going it alone can work for a while. Divisiveness can score some quick political wins, but COVID-19 has demonstrated that our inability to tackle common problems in collaboration will be to our collective detriment. For us, we at ICC, this crisis of these past months has only emboldened us to deliver with renewed vigour on our founding vision adopted more than 100 years ago. Our mission has never been more clear, our work never more essential. We will continue in this century, as in the last, to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Denton, for that incredibly thoughtful and timely address, which is in the best possible traditions of the Brookes Oration. You started with the importance of placing today's debates in a historical context. You've structured a conversation around the importance of globalisation, but globalisation in a caring and considered framework. You've made a very strong argument for the ICC and other NGOs to make sure that they fill a void that government either cannot fill or is unwilling to fill. And you've thrown down some really important challenges around the links between the economy and the broader health of the population, all of which are incredibly important, but ethically extraordinarily challenging. You've talked about the challenges of borders and how borders can help and protect, but at the same time, borders can harm, and making sure that we strike the right balance in delivering the kind of policies that is going to deliver the widest possible population the benefits, healthcare, and economic resilience that we all need. You've given us a wake-up call to make sure that as we emerge from the acute pain of the COVID-19 acute phase, that we look at the rules and frameworks that govern global trade, and has given us so much over the past 70 years to make sure they fully reflect both the lessons we've learned now and the opportunities of the future. Can I thank you so much for giving up the time to be part of the Deakin family and the Brookes Oration today. That formally concludes things. I'd like to thank you once again for being our orator for 2020, and thank all of our audience for your virtual physical attendance, but hopefully your very mindful presence. Thank you to everybody. Look after yourselves and take care. And certainly I look forward to meeting many of you again in the future. Thank you.